The world knew Little Richard as the architect of rock and roll, the man who taught the Beatles how to scream and showed Elvis how to move. But in a small recording studio in Los Angeles, on a humid afternoon in August 1984, he sat alone with a microphone and said the words he had been hiding for 37 years. "I have loved men, and I have loved women, and God has seen it all." The tape recorder kept rolling as he wept, confessing everything: the backstage encounters, the guilt that drove him to the pulpit 8 times, the lie he had been performing every single day since 1947. The interview was supposed to air on a documentary that never got made, and for decades those tapes sat forgotten in a cardboard box marked B-roll discard. When a junior archivist stumbled upon them in 2019, she didn't realize she was holding the key to rock and roll's most painful secret. Little Richard had tried to destroy these recordings 3 times, calling the studio in panic, begging them to burn the tapes, offering money, threatening lawsuits, but technology had failed him. Copies existed, scattered across 3 different archives, and the truth he had buried was about to surface. This is the story of what he said in that room, why he spent 40 years running from it, and how a confession meant to free him became the prison he could never escape. Before we continue with this story, if you appreciate deep dives into music history's hidden truths, please subscribe to our channel. These stories take weeks of research to uncover, and your support helps us keep bringing you the untold chapters of rock and roll. The Boy Who Couldn't Hide. Richard Wayne Penniman was born on December 5, 1932, in Macon, Georgia, into a world that had very specific rules about what a man should be. His father sold bootleg liquor and ran a tavern where young Richard first heard the sounds that would shape his life: blues, gospel, boogie-woogie piano played by men who pounded the keys like they were trying to break through to something divine. But even as a child, Richard knew he was different. He walked differently, talked differently, moved his hands in ways that made the other boys laugh, and made his father's face turn hard with shame. By the age of 12, Richard was wearing his mother's makeup and jewelry when no one was watching, practicing in front of mirrors, becoming someone he couldn't name but desperately needed to be. His father eventually threw him out of the house for being what he called an abomination. Richard moved in with a white family who ran a club and didn't seem to care how he dressed or moved. For the first time in his life, someone looked at him and didn't see something that needed to be fixed. The stage became his sanctuary, the one place where the sequins and the screams made sense, where the part of himself he had to hide everywhere else could finally breathe. But sanctuary and safety are not the same thing, and the cost of that freedom would follow him for the rest of his life. The birth of something dangerous. By 1955, Richard had been performing for years on the Chitlin circuit, trying to make it as a conventional rhythm and blues singer, recording songs that sounded like everything else on the radio, going nowhere. Then one day during a recording session break at J&M Studio in New Orleans, frustrated and exhausted, he sat down at the piano and started playing something he'd been messing around with backstage, a wild, hammering rhythm with words that didn't mean anything except pure energy. "A wop bop a loo bop a lop, bam boom," he screamed, his voice climbing into a falsetto that sounded like nothing else in popular music, like gospel and sex and anarchy all compressed into 3 seconds of sound. The producer immediately recognized what it was: something completely new, something dangerous, something that could either change everything or get them all killed. They recorded it in 3 takes, and when Tutti Frutti was released in November 1955, it detonated across America like a bomb. The song went to number 2 on the Billboard chart, but more importantly, it made white teenagers move their bodies in ways their parents found deeply threatening. Little Richard wasn't just playing music, he was performing liberation that challenged every rule about race, gender and sexuality that 1950s America was built on. He wore eyeliner and mascara, foundation and lipstick, his hair piled high in a pompadour. He wore sequined jackets, ruffled shirts, tight pants and shoes with heels. When he played, he stood at the piano, he kicked it, he climbed on top of it, his whole body a challenge to the idea that men should be restrained, and the audiences lost their minds. They screamed, they danced, they rushed the stage, they experienced something that felt like freedom. But backstage, after every show, Richard would lock himself in the dressing room and scrub off the makeup until his face was raw. He would get on his knees and pray, begging God to forgive him for what he'd just done, for who he'd just been. Because the same church that had taught him to sing had also taught him that what he was, a man who desired men, who wore makeup, who couldn't perform masculinity the way he was supposed to, was an abomination deserving of eternal fire. The stage gave him freedom for 90 minutes at a time, but the guilt was there every second, waiting to drag him back into shame the moment the lights went out. The plane, the fire, and the first escape. October 1957. Little Richard was at the absolute peak of his fame, touring Australia. He had money, fame, screaming fans everywhere he went. Then came the flight from Melbourne to Sydney. The plane hit violent turbulence. Richard looked out the window and saw one of the engines on fire, flames trailing behind the wing as the plane dropped. In that moment, convinced he was about to die, he made a deal with God. If the plane landed safely, he would quit music forever. He would give up the sequins, the makeup, the piano, everything that made him feel alive but also made him feel damned. He would become a preacher, someone who could finally scrub himself clean not just of the makeup but of the desires that makeup represented. The plane landed safely. Richard fulfilled his promise. He quit rock and roll at the height of his fame, enrolled in a Seventh-day Adventist school, and began studying to become a minister. He gave away his jewelry, threw his stage clothes in the trash, and tried to become someone acceptable. For a while it seemed to work. He preached in churches, recorded gospel albums, and spoke publicly about how rock and roll had been the devil's music. But the stage kept calling. The desire didn't go away, it just went underground, hidden, festering, and eventually it would drag him back. The returns, again and again. Richard's relationship with rock and roll over the next 6 decades was a cycle of escape and return, 8 separate times quitting and coming back, each time convinced it would be different, each time discovering it never was. In 1962, after 5 years of preaching, he watched the Beatles and Rolling Stones explode onto the scene, playing music that sounded suspiciously like the sound he had invented, and the bitterness was overwhelming. Paul McCartney openly admitted that Little Richard had been his primary influence. Mick Jagger had copied his stage moves. An entire generation of British rock stars owed their careers to the template Richard had created, and here he was, broke and forgotten, preaching to 50 people while kids who'd stolen his sound were playing to 50,000. The resentment pulled him back. He started performing again, though this time he told himself it would be different, he'd perform but stay righteous. But rock and roll and righteousness proved impossible to balance. The stage demanded everything, the energy, the sexuality, the wildness, and with the performance came the desires he'd tried to kill. So he'd perform for a year, maybe 2, and then the guilt would become unbearable again and he'd quit, returning to the pulpit, publicly renouncing rock music as evil. Each cycle the contradictions became sharper because he was trying to be 2 people who couldn't coexist. The flamboyant rock and roller who had revolutionized music and the conservative preacher who believed that very revolution had been sinful. And underneath both identities was the secret he couldn't tell anyone, the truth about his sexuality that would have destroyed him in either world. The confession nobody was supposed to hear. By August 1984, Richard was 51 years old and exhausted. A documentary filmmaker had approached him about doing an in-depth interview. Richard agreed, thinking it would be the usual questions about the early days. But when he sat down in that Los Angeles studio, something broke open. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the realization that he was running out of time to tell the truth. The camera wasn't rolling yet, just the audio recorder, and the filmmaker asked a warm-up question about regrets, and Richard started talking. He talked about the men he'd loved, musicians, road crew members, men whose names he'd never spoken aloud. He talked about the women he'd loved too, genuine romantic and sexual attraction that complicated the narrative people wanted to impose on him. He wasn't simply gay, though the world would have found that easier to categorize. He was bisexual, attracted to both men and women, which made the church's condemnation even more confusing because half of his desires fit their approved model and half didn't. He talked about the guilt that had followed him every day since he was 12, the voice telling him he was disgusting, sinful, bound for hell. He talked about the makeup as both liberation and disguise, a way to be himself and hide himself simultaneously. He wept as he talked, his voice breaking, because after 37 years of hiding, the relief of confession was overwhelming. But the moment the interview ended, the relief turned to terror. He had just said the words that could destroy everything. In 1984, being bisexual was still grounds for total social annihilation, especially for a black man trying to maintain credibility as a minister. Richard called the filmmaker 2 days later, frantic, begging him to destroy the tapes. The filmmaker said they were already archived. Richard called back offering money, $5,000, $10,000, whatever it took. He threatened lawsuits, insisted the tapes be destroyed immediately. The filmmaker agreed not to use them but didn't destroy them, and in the chaos of production, copies ended up in 3 different archives, one at the production company, one at a Nashville media archive, and one in a private collection. The secret that wouldn't stay buried. For 35 years, those tapes remained hidden. Richard continued his cycle of performing and preaching, each time the contradictions more visible, more painful to watch. In interviews through the 90s and 2000s, he would make contradictory statements about his sexuality, sometimes claiming he'd been gay but had been cured through faith, sometimes denying he'd ever been gay at all. He would condemn homosexuality in one interview and then show up at Pride events another year. The confusion wasn't manipulation, it was genuine torment, a man trying to reconcile irreconcilable things. Then in 2019, a junior archivist was cataloging boxes at a Nashville storage facility. She pulled a box labeled B-roll discard and found unmarked cassette tapes. She played one at random, and little Richard's voice filled her headphones. At first she thought it was just another interview, but as she kept listening she realized what she was hearing. A confession that had never been meant for public consumption. She immediately contacted her supervisor, who contacted the estate, who contacted lawyers. The ethical questions were massive. Richard was dead and couldn't consent to release, but he was also a public figure, and this recording addressed questions historians had been asking for decades. As of now, the 1984 confession has not been officially released in full. Portions have been transcribed and quoted in academic papers, enough to confirm its existence and content, but the complete audio remains restricted, caught in legal and ethical limbo. What we know from those transcripts is devastating. Richard talking about desire and guilt, love and shame, the stage as freedom and prison. He talked about specific encounters, relationships that had mattered deeply but that he'd never been able to acknowledge publicly. He talked about wishing he could have been born in a different time, where loving who you loved wasn't a sin requiring a lifetime of penance. The legacy of a man who couldn't be himself. Little Richard died on May 9, 2020, of bone cancer. He was 87 years old and had spent those years trying to reconcile who he was with who he thought he needed to be. The obituaries called him the architect of rock and roll, the performer who taught everyone from the Beatles to Prince how to be fearless on stage. Some mentioned his struggles with sexuality and faith, usually in careful language describing him as conflicted or complicated, as if those words could contain the magnitude of his suffering. But what the 1984 tapes reveal is that Little Richard's legacy isn't just about music, it's about the cost of visibility for queer people, especially queer people of color, especially in eras where visibility meant destruction. Richard created a template for gender non-conforming performance that liberated millions, gave them permission to be flamboyant, feminine, androgynous, wild. But he himself never got to experience that liberation. Every time he put on the makeup, he felt like he was sinning. The stage that freed everyone else was his prison, because he couldn't separate performance from identity, couldn't enjoy the persona he'd created because it was too close to the truth he was supposed to hide. The cycle of quitting and returning wasn't about indecision. It was a man drowning, coming up for air, going back under. The church told him salvation required killing a part of himself. Rock and roll told him success required revealing that same part. And he spent 6 decades trying to find a middle ground that didn't exist. The 1984 confession was supposed to be the moment he freed himself, but the moment the words left his mouth he realized the truth wasn't freedom, it was just a different kind of prison, because now the secret was out there, recordable, something he could never take back. So he tried to destroy it, tried to bury it again, spent the last 36 years of his life pretending that confession had never happened. The tape that refuses to die. The 1984 tape is crucial because it's the only time he told the whole truth without immediately retracting it. In other interviews he would hint at things and then deny them in the same breath. But in that recording for 90 minutes he stopped trying to please anyone. He talked about being 12 years old and knowing he was different and having no language for it. He talked about the first time he kissed a boy, backstage at a club in Macon, and how it felt right and wrong simultaneously. He talked about relationships with women that had been real and meaningful, not performances or attempts to appear straight but genuine attraction. He talked about the hypocrisy he saw everywhere, preachers who condemned him publicly but propositioned him privately, record executives who profited from his flamboyance but told him to tone it down, white rock stars who copied his style but didn't face the same judgment, and he talked about the loneliness, the specific isolation of being bisexual in a world that only understood heterosexuality or homosexuality, of being too queer for the straight world and not queer enough for the gay world. Near the end of the recording, his voice breaking, he said he wished he could go back to 1955 and never record Tutti Frutti. He wished he could have stayed small, local, never become famous, never created the persona that made him an icon and a prisoner simultaneously, because fame meant visibility, and visibility for someone like him meant danger. He said fame had ruined his life by making his private struggles into public spectacle, by turning his identity into entertainment, by making it impossible to figure out who he actually was because everyone was always watching, always judging. Why he could never let it go. The question everyone asks is, why couldn't Little Richard just accept himself? The answer is that it was never simple. First, Richard was deeply, genuinely religious. He believed in God, in judgment, in eternal consequences. And the version of Christianity he'd been raised in said clearly that homosexuality was a sin punishable by hellfire. For him to accept his bisexuality, he would have had to reject his faith, and he couldn't do that. His faith was as core to his identity as his sexuality. Second, he was a black man navigating an industry that had very specific ideas about black masculinity. Flamboyance was acceptable as performance, but being genuinely queer was seen as a betrayal of black manhood. Third, the generation he came from had no language, no framework for what he was. He was born in 1932, came of age in the 40s and 50s, when homosexuality was illegal, classified as mental illness. There were no pride parades, no representation. The only models he had were people who hid, people who suffered, people who died. And fourth, by the time the world had changed enough that he might have been able to come out safely, he was in his 60s and 70s, and the pattern was set. He'd spent 50 years building a particular narrative, and to admit the truth would have meant admitting he'd been lying for half a century. The question of release. The debate over whether to release the full recording is ongoing. Richard's estate opposes it, arguing that he explicitly wanted it destroyed. Music historians and advocates argue the opposite, that Richard was a public figure whose life has historical significance, that the recording provides crucial context for understanding his struggles and the broader experience of queer people in his era. Some suggest a middle ground, transcribe and quote the recording, but don't release the audio itself. Others say that's insufficient, that Richard's voice, his tone, his emotion are part of the historical record. There's no easy answer. Releasing it could help other people struggling with the same conflicts Richard faced, but it also treats his pain as educational content, turns his suffering into entertainment one more time. As of now, the tape remains restricted, accessible only to researchers with permission from the estate, but the conversation around it has already changed how we understand Little Richard. It's confirmed that his struggles with sexuality were real, not publicity stunts, and that the cost was his entire life. The performance that never ended. The last time Little Richard performed publicly was in 2013, at a benefit concert in Tennessee. He was 80 years old, frail, moving slowly. He sat at the piano and played a few songs, his voice weak but still recognizable. Witnesses say he seemed happy on stage, smiling, waving, soaking in the applause. But after the show, in the car back to his house, he reportedly broke down crying, saying he was tired, so tired, and he just wanted to rest. He wanted to stop performing, not just music, but the larger performance, the one he'd been doing since 1947, the constant balancing act between saint and sinner, between acceptable and authentic. He died 7 years later, still performing, still unable to reconcile the man the world celebrated with the man he believed God condemned. The 1984 tape is the only record we have of him trying to stop performing, trying to just be himself without the stage, without the audience. And even that moment became a performance in the end, something he regretted and tried to erase. What the tape actually reveals. The most important thing the 1984 confession reveals isn't just that Little Richard was bisexual. What it reveals is the cost of the closet, the specific torture of being forced to choose between identity and faith, between authenticity and acceptance. Richard's story is about how shame gets internalized, how it becomes a voice in your head that sounds like God, like your father, like everyone who ever told you that you were wrong. It's about how that voice doesn't go away even when the world becomes more accepting, because by then the shame is part of you, woven so deeply that removing it would mean unraveling everything. The tape reveals that Little Richard knew exactly what he was. He wasn't confused. He knew he loved men and women both. He knew the flamboyance and makeup were expressions of who he actually was. But knowing who you are and being allowed to be who you are two different things, and he lived in a time and place where permission was never granted. So he spent his life trying to kill the part of himself that everyone said was wrong, and when he couldn't kill it, he tried to hide it, and when he couldn't hide it, he tried to sanctify it by framing it as something he'd overcome. But you can't be saved from yourself, and the attempt broke him. The 1984 tape is a document of that breaking 90 minutes of a man trying to set himself free by telling the truth and realizing too late that the truth wouldn't free him. The conclusion: nobody wanted. Little Richard wanted to be remembered as a pioneer of rock and roll, as someone who found God, who lived a righteous life in the end. But the 1984 tape means he'll be remembered for something else too, as a casualty of a culture that couldn't accept him, as a man who spent 87 years trying to be acceptable and died without ever feeling accepted. That's not the legacy he wanted, but it's the legacy he left. The tape he tried to destroy became the most honest thing he ever produced, more honest than any performance, any song. It's the sound of a man dropping the act, just for a moment, and revealing the cost of having to perform at all. The tape hasn't been released in full, and maybe it never will be, but its existence has already changed the conversation. It's proof that the speculation wasn't speculation, that the pain was genuine. It's confirmation that Little Richard lived his entire life in a prison of shame, and the only time he tried to break free, he immediately tried to lock himself back in because freedom felt more dangerous than captivity. That's the real tragedy. Not that he was bisexual, but that he believed being bisexual made him unworthy of love, of God, of acceptance. The 1984 tape is the sound of a man realizing he'd wasted his life hiding, and then deciding to keep hiding anyway because the alternative was too terrifying. It's the sound of shame winning, permanently, and it's a warning that as long as we teach people that parts of themselves are unacceptable, as long as we force them to choose between identity and salvation, we'll keep creating more Little Richards, people who change the world and die without ever getting to be themselves. The tape exists, the confession happened, and the fact that it had to be buried tells you everything about the world he lived in, and the world we still haven't fully moved beyond.